everyone, and welcome to just another episode of Conversations with Coaches. My name is Luba Jessamidze. I'm the founder of Upthink Coaching, a coaching and coach training company. And in this series of interviews, I'm meeting different coaches, credentialed coaches who work across the variety of niches and approaches. Our guest today is Rafal Szaniawski. He is a grief coach and MCC credentialed with the ICF. Raf, thank you so much for being here. I'll give you a chance to talk more about yourself and your work.
Thank you so much for having me, and welcome everyone. Yes, my name is Raf. That's probably how people usually call me. Yes, as you mentioned, I'm a grief coach. I'm an MCC coach, so I run a practice that is called the Impermanent Human, and this is where I focus on working with people who go through loss and transition and they grieve. And I also have a little podcast called Impermanent Human Talks, where we really talk about the impermanence and the transition and grief. And that's where I focus most of my work in my private practice.
Thank you for sharing. That's quite a unique niche for coaches, I think. It's a bit of a sensitive niche. I know that maybe a lot of coaches could be cautious about doing this type of work. What inspired you to choose this niche?
Well, probably it won't surprise a lot of people that life called me to this. It wasn't an inspiration as such, but my personal story, which I discovered getting to know a lot of grief coaches, that their calling came from their life experience as well. So a few years ago, my mom became ill. I got curious and interested in the idea of life not being permanent and us losing people that we love. And unfortunately, when my mom passed a few years ago, I went fully into this space of exploring and understanding how we as humans relate to loss, and then how we grieve, and how we emerge from grief, and how we grow from grief, and how we change. And that became my life mission, as I would call it. And I was drawn into this, as I said, by my personal story, but then I discovered so much beauty, I want to say, so much inspiration, motivation, and so much humanity in this work. And I was completely drawn into this and decided to continue this and to focus on this and to train more in this and to work with more people and to become who I am now.
Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing. What did you discover that shaped your decision to stay with this niche?
I think one of the, I think it's the biggest, but yes, let's call it. I think one of the biggest revelations for me was that, obviously, because of my personal story, when I started working with grief, the connection was grief relates to death. And that was for me an immediate connection. So obviously very intense experience in the human life. But then when I started exploring this, I realized that grief is really connected to any loss that we experience in life. So as we go through life, we lose people, but we also lose things, identities, memories, and perceptions of ourselves, a lot of things. And loss is a very unique and human experience. And then when we lose things, we grieve. So my biggest revelation was that as humans, loss is so interconnected. It's just a crucial element of our life. And grief is part of human experience. So yes, there is attachment to grief as an experience of loss of a person, which in reality is called bereavement. But grief is really a deeply human experience, very profound experience. And then navigating this and shaping and growing in this experience is painful, but it's, for me, a very profoundly human experience. And that continues to inspire me when I work with people who are courageous enough to step into this and do the work, being human.
Right. Well, most of your clients, what are they looking for? What kind of requests they bring into coaching engagements?
So I think I have two types of clients. So one group of clients are those clients who specifically look for grief coaching or grief support. So these would be people who find me through referrals, through my work, through Google search, let's be honest. And they specifically come with this awareness of I am experiencing grief, or I think I'm experiencing grief. I lost someone or something, and they want to explore it, they want to work. So that's one of the type categories of my clients. The second is some group that I call them maybe accidental grievers. So a typical client in the second group would be a client that engages with me in a corporate coaching or executive coaching. And then at some point, we realize in the work that we do that there is an element of transition and loss. This may be a promotion that didn't happen. It may be a corporate restructuring. It may be losing a relationship, a friendship, or maybe losing opportunity that we hope would materialize. And then they are able to name it. I actually experienced loss, and it has a very interesting shape. And then we gently partner to introduce, well, maybe what you're experiencing is grief. And then this is the second type of client. This is the second group that maybe didn't start with this idea. This is a grief. But then they discovered in the work that what they're experiencing is really grief.
That's a very curious example. How do clients respond to the word grief emerging in conversations if initially it wasn't part of their request? Because I think that in many cultures, there's a certain taboo around the topic, right? So we know it's very sensitive. We do not intentionally dig deeper into that a lot of times, right? Just to be more mindful of feelings of other persons. So I guess the word itself comes a bit charged. So when the word appears in a coaching context, how do your clients respond to this?
An excellent observation. I think, like you said, there's a cultural element to discussing grief, talking about grief, and actually doing any grief work. So being obviously mindful of that, working with different clients, said the reaction is sometimes it's a surprise. I didn't think about this, that this is grief, right? I mean, I didn't get promoted. I'm just angry. I don't know, there's an element of disappointment. But then I never introduced this like from a get-go. It usually comes from an exploration saying that I lost this opportunity. And then, so how do you feel about this? And then at some point, the word grief comes up. Sometimes I offer this in a way that maybe is like, would you call it? To me, it sounds like you're grieving. And very often there's this sense of relief. There's a sense of discovery. Oh my God, this is it. And we know that in psychology, there's this strategy, name it to tame it, that naming this emotion, naming what you're going through, very often enables them to do work with this and actually move not on, but move forward with this. So the reaction answering your question is very often of a surprise. It's always a positive reaction in terms of there is a constructive engagement with this, right? But I think mostly it is a surprise and then a sense of relief and liberation. And I would say hope, because once they name it, they see, okay, now I know what's going on. I can do something about this. Can you help me work through this? So this would be my observations.
It does sound liberating indeed. And I'm also hearing that you're able to combine a few different lines of work, right? So the grief coaching for people who experience loss and more corporate work. So I also know that some coaches think that once they pick a niche, they feel obligated to commit to it, to marry the niche and then not step sideways, right? So what are your thoughts on this? What helps you do these different lines of work?
We're asking a person whose brand is the impermanence. So I would always look back and say, listen, whether you choose a niche today, it may change tomorrow, because that's the nature of human life. So first of all, even if today, and I remember a few years ago, I was a career coach and I was attached to this and then I shifted because I no longer felt this is my work. So, whatever I teach, mentor, and supervise, when I teach, I always say, whatever you choose, don't be attached to this, because you will change as a human and a coach. And that's a perfectly amazing thing to do, because next year next week, you might discover you want to do completely different type of work. And that's amazing, because you have the skills, and those skills enable you to work with different clients, with different situations. Remember, we're not experts in a specific field. Our service is to hold space for people, to have conversation, to ask questions, to reflect back. And if someone comes with a career change or a grief or anything else, you are able to do it. So if someone says, yes, I always say I blended like good makeup or foundation, because I have a lot of, and in my practice and in my work with both executives, corporate clients, and I work with corporate clients in the transition and change, and with individual clients, it's really about being able to observe and see what's happening and potentially help them name what is really happening. So I don't just box myself saying I only work with people who come with grief, right? Because I know that this grief is really related to change, transition, evolution, shift in their identity, whatever that is, right? So my offering would be, yes, if you decide to choose a niche, immediately be accepting of the fact that it might not be your niche for the rest of your life. And it's amazing. So, and remember that you have skills and capabilities that don't limit you to do only one type of work. So hopefully this will help people to experiment a bit more and to see if they can actually be more of service to different types of clients, to people in different spaces and places in their life.
Right. And I think as I'm listening to you, I'm also thinking about the identities that people create. So if a person says, I do career coaching, it sounds different from I am a career coach, right? So when we give ourselves a label, then maybe we tend to identify more with that. And then it's more challenging to disconnect from that, right? Because we've accepted it as part of our identity, not just what we do. What are your thoughts on this?
Absolutely. I mean, we both know we are both coaches, and we know that, in general, the stories we tell ourselves, right? Then the narrative around I am versus what I do. Like you said, sometimes it's our own doing and thinking that blocks us and limits us, right? So yes, even if I am a career coach now, I would always invite everyone to be reflective of that and just see, yes, you are today, but will you be tomorrow? No one knows. Maybe you will, but maybe you won't. And there's this element of really being mindful of our own narrative, our own story, and the identity, as you said, that we project and also that we hold about ourselves, right? It's interesting when you said that, because I said at the beginning, I am a Greek coach, right? But in a way, when you ask me this question now, I realized that I don't have this strong attachment to see, like, this is my identity. But maybe because over the last few years, I started talking about my work, and I usually say I help people live, die, and grieve. And that is my way of talking. So I think maybe I would invite anyone who is watching and listening to just continuously reflect how we talk about the work we do and how this language can help both us and clients and connect these two worlds.
Exactly, because we're not just talking to ourselves, right? We are also establishing ourselves, like we are basically telling other people how to perceive us or how we want to be perceived, right? And then I guess as coaches, we often need to think in both directions. How do I perceive myself and my work? And how do I communicate this to the people that I aspire to work with?
Absolutely. And I think the question of how you really connect with the market, let's say with the clients, it always comes up in the conversation. And I even wrote this piece a few years ago, and I still, when I teach and mentor, I always say, listen, being is selling. And exactly like you said, being with a person, being with a client or potential client. So how you talk about your work, how you talk about what you do is the critical element, because we are working in a relationship-based business. People want and need to trust you. with sometimes the most intimate and profound stories of their life. So how you really show up, how you really talk about the work that you do. For me, as you said, it is a critical element of my existence, well, in the market, let's be honest, and really connecting the people that might benefit from my service, right?
I have another question to you. You mentioned earlier that you dedicated some time to learn more about grief coaching and grief work. So I was willing to ask you more about the training that you did, because for some coaches, I guess this area might be a borderline area. How do we distinguish between therapy around grief or counseling and coaching?
Great question. And this question comes up, I would say, probably always because of the nature of the work. So I think I would respond, because you've asked me questions, and I would respond with two elements. So one is that maybe with the shorter part, but about education. Before I really started working with people, and I did training in grief, first of all, to understand, because grief is not a singular thing. There are types of grief. So I wanted to have an in-depth understanding of grief as a human psychological process and physiological process, because this has two layers. So before working and understanding how I can support them as a coach, I wanted to really understand what grief really is, how it shows up, and what are different types. And obviously that opened a lot of exploration. So I did training for therapists, a clinical practice training. I did a lot of hours of training to really have an in-depth, I believe, understanding of what grief is and isn't, how it shows up, and because grief, very briefly, is a normal adaptive process. However, and that would lead me to discussing the differences, there are certain types of grief that really are, I would say, experiences that would require a therapy or a different intervention than a coaching. So this education around types of grief really helped me understand where is the ethical boundary between working with a normal, healthy, adaptive process of integrating loss into our life versus the recognizing when the client is experiencing types of grief that I should never engage with as a coach, and I should have a gentle conversation with the client that maybe they should seek professional advice from a counselor or a therapist, because their grief, to me, in my view, is really the type which we can call complicated or prolonged, for example, or related to trauma, that they really need to address with a specialist in the clinical care, because that is the very big boundary. And if you're a coach, you don't have any therapy background, you're not a therapist or counselor, you're absolutely fine working with a healthy, normal grieving process. However, as a coach, you should never, I should say, you should maybe make this statement, but from the ethical perspective, from my point of view, you should not engage, if you're not qualified, with a process that requires clinical support. And that's a big boundary. So both as obviously a coach who is accredited by ICF in EMCC, I'm bound by code of ethics, which we know there is a referral of a client guide, how to not engage in therapy and counseling. And simply as a human, I always say, do not make harm. Because this is a huge responsibility to work with someone in someone's life. So just being mindful of where's the boundary of my work and where I need to have the conversation, saying, you might want to see somebody else.
Would it be possible to provide some examples so that we could actually see what are the topics or areas that are okay to bring into grief coaching, and what are the topics or areas that definitely need to be referred?
So I would give you two examples. So imagine that there is a client who comes to you and they tell you that they lost someone, and this loss was unexpected and or involved some traumatic event. It can be a suicide, it can be, I'm just being very honest. It can be a suicide, it can be miscarriage, it can be murder or sudden death. And then this is the first moment, if this is the story, to pause before engaging as a coach and having a conversation, because this might be a grief that is related to a traumatic event in someone's life. And if that's the case, then you might to be very careful that maybe this person really first needs to see a psychologist or a therapist to see if their grief is not trauma-related grief, because if that's the case, then they would need to have, first of all, different types of support. And the second case is that someone comes to me and then they experience different type of loss. It can be really from, obviously, on the spectrum from losing someone in their life to losing a job or to losing a promotion or not being promoted. But as you discover talking with them, you see and notice that the process is really impacting their life in a way that impacts their functioning. It can be, for example, people not leaving their house, people not leaving their bed, people not taking care of their hygienic needs or other basic physiological needs. So if you see that their process is not moving forward, is keeping them stuck, or is impacting the way those basic human functions. And that's also the moment when you need to pause before really engaging as a coach and potentially refer the client to a therapist or a psychologist or a psychiatrist, because it means that there is something going on in the process that relates to mental health. And as I always say, we don't do the repair work in the mental health space as coaches.
Is traumatic episode always a reason to refer a client to a therapist? And I'm asking because I've been doing these interviews and talking to really different types of coaching. As a mindful instructor, I did some trauma orientation, programs myself, and I thought that was very insightful. Like all coaches should have some basic understanding of trauma. And one of the previous guests in one of the episodes was someone working within the trauma-informed or trauma-oriented or trauma-empowered approach. And within that approach, the interpretation of trauma is really wider, I guess, right? It's any kind of events that shakens us or any change. And I guess just because both modalities are evolving, therapy is evolving and coaching is evolving, I guess some of the concepts that were traditionally part of one modality by default are moving in between modalities. So I'm curious maybe to see more from you as someone experienced in this niche. How do you make the discernment?
Great question. And I would say, I would never say work or don't work, or never work with someone who experienced trauma. I think for me, as I said, it's a moment of pause and seeing what is really going on, where the client is, to really make sure that we don't risk re-traumatizing or making harm. So I wouldn't say that, yes, you should immediately refer someone to a therapist. I would say just pause before you really engage and really understand the full client's context as much as they share in the moment, just to be more informed as a coach, just to be more cautious maybe, and just to, especially if you, for example, have been trained in a trauma-informed coaching or things like that, to see what really is the best and ethical way of supporting a client like that. Because as you said, it is evolving, right? Those modalities are evolving. The knowledge of trauma and coaching obviously is evolving. We get more and as more people get trained. And yet I would still say, reflect, pause, and see what's the best way forward, right?
Mm-hmm. So would it be fair to say, when you pause and explore, if a person is capable, but has the inner outer resources to move forward and they're more forward looking, even in their grief, they can be considered for coaching work? Whereas when a person needs to heal and process and stay with it, then they're most likely suitable therapy client.
I would say yes, and slightly different ways. I would say that, remember that grief is a process of, we call it oscillating. So it oscillates between sort of the the past and the future. Let's simplify for a moment, right? So just when you work with a person, yes, in general, if you see that they are moving forward with their process, that they are just, depending on which type of work you do, whether you do mimic making or hello again, narrative, things like that, if they do the work and then you see that they are really moving forward with the group, they're able to, I don't say to grow, but to move forward and to navigate and integrate the loss, I would say yes, absolutely fine. Just being cautious that, that the process is dynamic and they may suddenly be back in the past and do the work. So just being mindful of that. But yes, absolutely. If you see that the client, despite the, for example, traumatic event, they move forward and they process the loss and they progress, then absolutely fine. As long as you don't get the client somewhere where they shouldn't be with you because maybe we don't have this, I don't have this capacity to hold the space for them as a non-qualified therapist, right?
Right. So what could be some typical, if this word is applicable at all, some typical interventions that grief coaching may have?
Well, okay, how much time do we have? No, I mean, no,
In a
no,
nutshell, to give our viewers some basic ideas about maybe what to expect when they come to a grief coaching session, right? What might it be like? What are some of the questions or frameworks that the coach might be suggesting?
So I will maybe tell you very briefly how I do work. And then this might, because, there are a lot of different approaches and models, but I mean, one of the basic things for my work is to name the loss. It might be surprising, but what do you mean? It's obvious or not? Like, but very often this is not the case. So the first thing you want to really get the client, invite them to name what they lost. And obviously sometimes it's, oh, well, I lost a person, right? I lost someone I loved. But in reality, even this is not fully a description of a loss because they lost relationships, emotions, rituals, a lot of those things. So really naming the loss is a first step to see what you really are losing, what you really are grieving. And then it's really about inviting the client using different things like photography, drawing, talking, obviously, to imagine the world when the person or the object that we lost is no longer with us, but the relationship is, because that's the nature of grief, that the person or the promotion or the opportunities is no longer with us, but our relationship with this object or person remained. It just changed the shape. And then that's the thing for the client to see how they want to continue this relationship, if they want to, what is really the shape of it. And you can use, for example, a narrative practice where we say, well, there's a practice called hello again. So it's really about reestablishing the relationship with, for example, the person they lost, right? To see, well, for example, a husband who used to have long walks with his wife, and then she passed, and then, well, how would you like to continue the relationship with her? And then he wants to continue those walks, right? Because for him, it's a way of remembering her and honoring the legacy. It's really inviting the clients. How do you make the meaning of the loss? How do you want to look your life to look like now when this person or this opportunity or the thing is no longer with you, right? That will be inviting the clients to visualize the life after, the life as it continues now, what it would mean for them to have a life that still feels like as much as it can, a fulfilling life. Because we always go back to this quote from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, that you will never be the same, but you will be whole again, which sometimes is a shocking thing at the beginning of the grieving process, but life will continue because life doesn't wait for us in a way. But then we have this power to shape this life in a way that feels most fulfilling or desired by us. So I know I gave you a bit of a round answer, but that would be the first two things. Name the loss and then try to see what the life do look like for you now when life is just different than it was before the loss.
Right. Well, this opens the door for some really vulnerable conversations. What skills or capacities do you think it's important for coaches to develop so that they can hold space for their clients around the grief topic?
Self-care. So I think that this is because we are also humans. So I think it's very important to, obviously, as we said, get trained and understand how this process works and understand what the boundaries are. But then similar to typical coaching space, you would really need to be able to hold space, as we say, right? And I always, when I teach this and I was mentor, I always say, remember that we do not rescue the client. We need to be mindful how much of us is involved in the client's work, because that's the important thing. And then really, because the emotions are extremely high sometimes, it's important to remember that we're humans and we don't rescue, we don't offer solution. So it's really about building this skill set of remembering my work is much more powerful when I'm outside and I help them and I guide them, but I don't carry this for them. I don't rescue them. And by rescue, I mean, obviously, if they're experiencing that sometimes very difficult moment, sometimes extremely profound moment of falling apart, our work is really around trusting the process to unfold and giving the safe space for them to do it, rather than jumping in and doing the work for them or suggesting some things. So holding space, not rescuing the client, trusting the process, witnessing the process to unfold, and holding this boundary, and then remembering that we don't carry their weight for them. So also being mindful of our own triggers and activators, because sometimes the client's loss will mirror our loss. So when I coach, giving the example, when I coach a client who's lost their mother, I am double cautious about how I show up, because it immediately reminds me of my own loss, right? So being mindful where their loss mirrors yours, and how do you really engage that you don't project the coach yourself. And then being able to have a ritual to make sure that you reset, you really calibrate your capacity so you don't overstretch, that you don't commit too many coaching sessions a day if you're not able to hold that space for people who experience this. So a bit of a practical in the session skills and a bit of a ritual outside the session to make sure that your coaching is really sustainable as a practice.
Yeah, thank you. I think these are all very important things, even when you don't work with super sensitive topics, right? But I also believe that for topics like grief coaching, the processes of transference and counter-transference may be quite powerful and require more self-management, self-awareness on the coach's part.
Yes, and especially, like you said, and especially because it may trigger something that is profoundly, for example, sad for us. Even if our loss happened many years ago, you may go back to this experience. So, like I always say, listen, you're a coach, amazing coach, and you are also a human being. So and you may be vulnerable in the session, especially if there is a kind of a connection, a relationship between their loss, right? So yes, being mindful of that and just being able to manage and navigate this in the best way possible for you as a coach and for them as a client.
Right. Well, on this note, I actually got another question as I was listening right now. So do you think this niche, this type of work could suit a newer coaches, or in order to step into this work, it's advisable to have a certain level of experience or maturity, just because there may be a lot more triggers than in regular coaching engagements?
Great question. I'm trying to see how I can answer politically correct way. No, I'm going to be very honest.
I invite you to answer in the way that you think is most helpful for coaches who might consider this work, and maybe just for coaches. We don't want clients to be biased, right? We want clients to make their own judgment about who's a good coach for them.
Absolutely, and I would agree. It was a bit of a joke, but I'm always very authentic and open. I would always say, whether you have 100 hours or 4,000 hours in this space, it doesn't matter if you don't have the confidence, first of all, to sit with clients who go through grief, and capabilities and abilities. So if you believe that, and you are a very new coach, if you believe that you have the knowledge about, as I said, about grief, what it is, and coaching skills and confidence to hold the space and guide the people, I would say if you feel called to do it, go for it. Make sure you have safeguarding in place in terms of like a supervisor, and just to make sure that if you need someone to help you, you can call on these people. If you have 4,000 hours, 5,000 hours, you're much more experienced coach, I would say the same thing. But then I would also say, don't think that because you have so many hours, you are in any way better equipped or prepared to do this type of work than a coach who has 100 hours. Even though I have nearly 4,000 hours, I still see myself as a student here, because every client and every story is a very different experience for me. And I continue learning, I would say, improving my craft. So for me, answering your question, it can be both for newer coaches and more experienced coaches. I think the important element for me is the abilities, capabilities, and the confidence to do it.
Yeah. And I guess what I'm sensing throughout the whole conversation that I'm having with you is humility, especially resonating with the idea of impermanence, because, what you become tomorrow, it might be a fresh start, right? So when your today's skills or capacity may not be fully enough, and you still need to learn something new or to be open and to see just because everything's changing.
Absolutely. And in grief, I often talk about this. The grief is such a unique experience that for me, it's a continuous work. About reading, first of all, obviously how it shows up. But as I said, every client and their story shows me that, oh wow, this is such a uniquely different and individual process and experience that every time I speak with someone, I learn something about how they process this.
Yeah. So we are getting close to the end of our conversation, right? So I was wondering if you were to give some guidelines or suggestions to coaches who are truly interested in doing this work, what would you recommend?
I would say, first of all, have a moment of self-reflection and think, is this something you would like to do? And then why you want to do it? What calls you to this type of work? Simply not to limit you, but just to be more mindful, intentional about why you want to do it. It usually, my experience, helps, and it helps us motivate ourselves to develop, grow, and actually do it. Then the second thing is, from my experience, get trained. So obviously get trained in coaching, but I would assume a lot of people would already be coaches. So get trained in my experience. So I'm sharing my advice, get trained in grief as a process, just to understand it. And then, the same parallel, get trained in grief coaching. There are quite a few programs. If you're an accredited coach, quite a few programs that I see accredited. Choose the one that you see that maybe calls you and speaks to the way you would sit with client, maybe to some kind of different types of modalities and approaches, because I know there are quite a few. So get trained and then start the work. Build, as I said, safeguardings, have a support system in place. There is, for example, Grief Coaching Alliance. So it's a group of us coaches who do grief work. So you can always find us. It's griefcoachingalliance.org. It's a non-profit organization of people like me, and have a support group in a way to help you sometimes. But yeah, if you're called to do it, get properly trained and just go and do it. And accept the fact that this might not be a final destination in your coaching life.
Thank you so much. This sounds beautiful. I really enjoy the conversation, Rav. I really love how you unpack the topic of grief as more complex, that it's not just one thing, that it's part of life, right? And just because we don't take intentional efforts or time to study it or research it, it doesn't go anywhere, right? It's part of life, and we face grief and loss regularly, right? So it's an important process to consider, to bring to our attention. So I think that was very insightful. Thanks for everyone who was watching. You can find all Raf's contact information in the episode description. Feel free to reach out, explore his programs, his offers, and the work he's doing, and also get in touch on social media. And I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks so much again, Raf.
Thank you so much for having me. Look forward to talking more about the Greek work.